7:38 in the morning. April 18th, 1942. The USS Hornet is pitching hard in the North Pacific. 20-foot swells, rain slashing sideways across the flight deck. Jimmy Doolittle sits in the cockpit of his B-25. He looks out at the runway in front of him. 467 feet of wet steel deck. That is all the runway he has, and at the end of it, nothing, just gray ocean and a 60-foot drop. He already knows what the fuel gauges will say when this is over. Not enough to get back. There is no ship waiting for him on the other side of Japan. No rescue plan, no extraction route. Washington had given these 80 men an assignment, and quietly decided not to plan for their return. Doolittle knew that before he ever stepped foot on this carrier. He got in the cockpit anyway. 2 hours later, smoke was rising over Tokyo, and Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the most powerful naval commander in the Pacific, the man who had planned Pearl Harbor, the man who had delivered Japan's greatest military triumph, walked into his private cabin aboard the battleship Yamato, closed the door, and handed command to his chief of staff. His chief of staff opened his diary that evening and wrote 7 words. Today, the victory belongs to the enemy. Not because Tokyo was burning, but because no one in the Imperial Japanese High Command, not one admiral, not one general, not one intelligence officer, could answer a single question. Where did those 16 planes come from? That question, that one unanswered question, would trigger a chain of decisions that ended Japan's power in the Pacific for the rest of the war. And the man who started it all was sitting in a muddy field in China that night, certain he was going to face a military tribunal. Before we go any further, the youngest World War II veterans alive today are in their late 90s. Most are gone, and when they go, the stories go with them. Not the history book version, the real stories, the ones they told at the dinner table, the ones they never told anyone. If your father served in this war, if your grandfather wore that uniform, write his name in the comments. Write where he served, what he did, what you remember him saying. Even one sentence keeps that story alive. These men deserve more than a name on a monument. They deserve to be remembered as people. So, do that for them. Right now, before the video ends. In the spring of 1942, Japan had been at war for exactly 4 months. In those 4 months, they had seized Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, and Wake Island. They had pushed the British Navy out of the Indian Ocean. They had sunk or disabled most of the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. And through all of it, through every advance, every victory, every island falling, not a single enemy bomb had landed on Japanese soil. Not one. The Japanese military did not consider this luck. They considered it math. Their strategists had done the calculations carefully, methodically, the way serious military planners do. They looked at every American bomber in service. They measured the range of each one. They marked the nearest American base on the map. The nearest base capable of launching a bombing raid was Midway Island, 2,000 miles from Tokyo. The longest-range American bomber available in early 1942 could fly roughly 1,500 miles with a combat load. 1,500 miles. 2,000 miles. The numbers did not add up. They could not add up. Japan was safe. Not because their enemies lacked the courage to attack, but because their enemies lacked the aircraft to reach them. This was not arrogance. This was arithmetic. And so Japan built its defenses accordingly. Their anti-aircraft batteries around Tokyo were well-maintained, well-staffed, and trained to shoot down exactly what they expected to see. Carrier-based fighters and dive bombers, small, fast aircraft. Nobody trained them to shoot at a twin-engine, medium-range Army bomber flying at 200 feet off the ground. Nobody trained them because nobody imagined such a thing was possible. The civilian population of Tokyo had no air raid shelters, no evacuation routes, no practice drills. Why would they need any of that? The ocean itself was their protection. 12,000 miles of it, stretching between Japan and the American coast. In the spring of 1942, There was not a man or woman in Tokyo who went to bed at night afraid of American bombs. There was, however, one man in Japan's military who worried. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the most respected naval mind in Japan. Yamamoto had spent time in the United States. He had studied at Harvard, served as a naval attaché in Washington. He knew Americans in a way most Japanese officers did not, and something about their silence bothered him. After Pearl Harbor, after all those losses, the Americans had gone quiet. No major naval strike, no retaliation of any kind. He wrote about his unease in letters to close friends. He told them the people celebrating Japan's safety were wrong. Their confidence was not something Japan had earned. It was something the Americans had not yet chosen to take away. He raised his concerns formally with the Naval General Staff. He suggested that an American carrier task force might attempt to strike the home islands directly. The General Staff reviewed the same calculations every other Japanese strategist had reviewed: the ranges, the distances, the aircraft types. Their conclusion was the same as everyone else's: impossible. Yamamoto did not argue further. He had made his case. They had rendered their judgment. He let the matter drop. On the morning of April 18, 1942, the cherry blossoms were in full bloom in Tokyo. It was a Saturday. Families were out walking. Children were flying kites in the parks. Vendors were selling food along the riverbanks. The city was alive with the particular kind of ease that comes from winning a war and knowing you are untouchable. High above the streets, a formation of low-flying aircraft approached from the east. People on the rooftops looked up and waved. They assumed, naturally, that the planes were Japanese. Nobody had told them to assume anything else. There was no reason to. The planes flew on, and in 40 minutes, everything Japan believed about itself would be wrong. Before we talk about what happened over Tokyo, you need to understand who Jimmy Doolittle actually was, because the version of this story most people know treats him like a symbol, a hero, a name on a plaque. But symbols don't sweat through a cockpit above the Pacific. Symbols don't lie awake at night doing math on a fuel calculation that keeps coming up short. Men do. James Harold Doolittle was not a career soldier. He had not come up through West Point. He had not spent his 20s climbing the peacetime ranks. He was a stunt pilot, a daredevil. A man who in the 1920s and 30s made his reputation by flying faster and lower and closer to the ground than anyone believed was survivable. In 1929, he became the first pilot in history to take off, fly a full course, and land entirely on instruments, with a canvas hood over his cockpit, so he could not see anything outside. He also had a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT. So, when people looked at Doolittle, they saw a showman. What they missed was the engineer underneath, a man who understood precisely and technically exactly what an aircraft could and could not do. And in the winter of 1942, that combination, the daring and the precision, was exactly what this mission required. The idea had started with a Navy captain named Francis Lowe. Lowe had been watching Army twin-engine bombers making practice runs over a runway painted to look like a carrier deck. He had a thought. If those planes could simulate taking off from a carrier, could they actually do it? It had never been done, not once in the history of aviation. A medium bomber needs at least 1,500 feet of runway to get airborne. An aircraft carrier deck is less than 500. The physics said no. But Lowe took the idea to Admiral King anyway, and King took it to General Arnold, and Arnold called one man, Jimmy Doolittle. Doolittle worked the problem the way an engineer works a problem. Strip the aircraft down, remove every pound that isn't essential. The belly gun turret came out. The liaison radio came out. The bomb sight was replaced with a simple 20-cent metal sight that one of his men had designed in a hotel room. Extra fuel tanks were installed in the bomb bay and in the cabin itself. Not proper tanks, rubber bladders, tin cans strapped to the floor with rubber tubing running to the engines. 80 men would fly across the Pacific Ocean with improvised fuel tanks sitting open in their cabins, leaking fumes the entire way. One spark, one static discharge, one cigarette lit by a nervous gunner. That was all it would take. Doolittle knew this. He approved it anyway, because there was no other way. He trained his crews for 6 weeks at Eglin Field in Florida. Short field takeoffs, low-altitude flying, navigation over open water. He told them almost nothing about where they were going. Most of them figured it out. Japan was the only target that made sense. What they did not figure out, what Doolittle chose not to tell them directly, was the fuel calculation. The original plan had called for launching 400 miles from Japan. At that distance, with careful throttle management, the B-25s could reach the Chinese coast, just barely, with almost nothing left in the tanks. But on the morning of April 18th, a Japanese patrol boat spotted the task force 650 miles out, 12 hours early, 250 miles too far. Doolittle had a choice: turn back or launch. He stood on the flight deck of the Hornet in the rain, looked at his men standing by their aircraft, and gave the order to launch. He did not call a meeting. He did not explain the new fuel numbers to all 80 crews. He already knew what the math said. He had been carrying that math alone since the night before. Some of those planes would not have enough fuel to reach the airfields in China. That was now a certainty. He kept that to himself. And he walked to his aircraft. Doolittle was the first to go. 467 feet of pitching, rain-soaked deck. A 60-foot drop to the ocean if he didn't pull it off. And a B-25 loaded so heavy with fuel that the engineers back home had said the takeoff was borderline impossible. The deck officer swung his flag. Doolittle pushed the throttles to full. The plane shook. The engines screamed. He ran the length of the deck in seconds. The bow dropped into a trough between two swells, and for one moment the plane was pointed not at the sky but directly at the ocean. Then the bow came back up, and Doolittle flew. The men watching from the deck let out a sound that one of them later described as half cheer, half prayer. 15 more planes still had to follow him. Inside each cockpit, as the Hornet disappeared behind them, the crews settled into the long flight west. The cabin smelled of aviation fuel. The rubber bladder tanks sweated fumes into the enclosed space. Crews were ordered not to smoke, not to use the radio, not to make any electronic transmission that might give away their position. 5 men in a metal tube, flying low over open ocean, toward a country that did not know they were coming. And not one of them knew with certainty whether they had enough fuel to land on the other side. Doolittle knew. He was doing the math in his head the whole way. The extra distance. The fuel burn at low altitude versus the planned cruise altitude. The headwind they had fought getting off the deck. He had committed to this. Not just to the mission, but to being the man who absorbed the weight of what the mission actually was, so the men behind him could focus on flying. That was his job now. Not the stunt pilot, not the record setter, not the MIT engineer. Just a man in a cockpit 200 feet above the Pacific, doing math no one else needed to know about, and flying west. Shortly after noon on April 18th, 1942, Jimmy Doolittle's B-25 crossed the Japanese coastline. He was flying at 200 feet, low enough that people in the streets could see his face if they looked up at the right moment. Most of them did look up. In a working-class neighborhood of wooden shops and narrow alleys along the eastern bank of the Sumida River in Tokyo, a group of men were working on a rooftop. They heard the engines first. Then they saw the planes coming in low from the east, gray against the pale April sky, moving fast. One of the men raised his arm and waved. He was waving at what he assumed were Japanese aircraft returning from a training exercise. The white star on the fuselage was there to see, if you knew what a white star meant. But why would a Japanese civilian know what an American military insignia looked like? The planes flew over. The man kept waving. At the Imperial Palace, the Emperor's staff noticed nothing unusual. The palace guard had been informed that Japanese aircraft would be conducting training flights over the city that morning. When the first reports of anti-aircraft fire reached the palace, an aide initially assumed it was part of the exercise. The assumption lasted about 30 seconds. Then a bomb hit an industrial facility in the Honjo district. Then a tank farm near the waterfront caught fire. Then the phone lines to the Naval General Staff started ringing all at once. The Japanese anti-aircraft crews reacted the way any unit reacts when confronted with something they were never trained for. Slowly, then wrongly. The B-25s were flying at 200 feet. Anti-aircraft guns are calibrated and angled for targets coming in at 2,000 feet or higher. The gunners elevated their barrels as far down as the mounts would allow. It was not far enough. The shells burst above the planes, or behind them, or simply detonated in open air while the bombers passed underneath and kept going. A few Japanese fighters scrambled from a nearby airfield. They found the B-25s. They could not catch them. A B-25 at low altitude, throttles wide open, is faster than the fighters of 1942 expected it to be. The fighters made passes. They scored no hits on any of the 16 bombers over Japanese airspace, not one. Doolittle dropped his bombs on industrial targets in the northern part of the city. He did not linger. He turned his aircraft south and pushed the throttles forward. He did not look back at the smoke. He did not wait to see the secondary explosions. There was no time and no fuel for anything but flying. The coastline of Japan passed beneath him. Then open ocean, then nothing but water and wind, and the sound of two engines that had now been running for nearly 4 hours on fuel that was always going to run short. Doolittle pointed his plane toward China and began doing the math again. Behind him, the other 15 B-25s cleared Japanese airspace one by one over the next 40 minutes. Each crew had bombed their assigned targets: Tokyo, Yokohama, Yokosuka, Nagoya, Kobe. The damage was real, but not crippling. An oil storage facility, a power station, several factory buildings, a handful of fires that would be put out by evening. By any conventional military measure, the raid had accomplished very little. The Japanese military would assess the physical damage within hours and file a report that said essentially the same thing: minor, containable, militarily insignificant. That report was correct, and it was also completely beside the point, because while the fires were still burning, the phone calls were already happening. Urgent calls, confused calls, from the anti-aircraft batteries, from the naval air stations, from the coastline observation posts, and every call was trying to answer the same question. What were those planes? Not fighters, too big, too slow, not carrier aircraft, wrong shape, wrong engine sound, wrong silhouette entirely. One observer reported twin engines, another reported 4. A third said the planes had come from the northwest. A fourth said the east. The reports contradicted each other because the men filing them had never been trained to identify what they were looking at. Nobody had trained them, because nobody had imagined this aircraft would ever appear over Japan. The Naval General Staff convened an emergency session within hours of the raid. The question on the table was simple: where did they come from? The B-25. Mitchell is a land-based medium bomber. It requires a long runway to take off. There is no American base within range of Tokyo with a runway that long. Therefore, the B-25s could not have come from a land base. But they also cannot take off from an aircraft carrier. The deck is too short. Everyone in that room knew this. It was a physical impossibility, except that it had just happened. The room went quiet. Someone suggested the planes had launched from a secret base in Soviet territory. Someone else suggested they had been assembled at a hidden airfield in China. A third officer proposed that the Americans had developed a new long-range variant of the aircraft that no one in Japanese intelligence had detected. All 3 explanations were wrong. None of the men in that room arrived at the correct answer: that an American task force had sailed to within 650 miles of Japan, launched 16 Army bombers off the deck of a Navy carrier, and then turned around and gone home. The correct answer was not on the table because the correct answer was not supposed to be possible. Outside the meeting room, the Japanese government was already working on its public statement. The raid had been minor. The damage was contained. The enemy had attempted to terrorize the Japanese people and had failed. Japanese fighters had engaged the attackers. Some enemy planes had been shot down. This last part was not true. Not one B-25 had been lost over Japan. But the government needed a story that matched what the math said should have happened. And so they built one. The cherry blossoms were still falling in Tokyo that evening. The fires had been put out, the streets were quiet, high above the city, the smoke had thinned to a gray smear across the April sky. In his private cabin aboard the battleship Yamato, Admiral Yamamoto sat alone with a report his staff had compiled from all the contradictory accounts. He read it carefully. Then he set it down. And he did something that, in the Japanese Navy, was almost without precedent. He told his chief of staff to take command, and he closed the door. To understand what happened inside that cabin, you have to understand who Isoroku Yamamoto was before April 18, 1942. Not the legend, the man. Yamamoto had opposed the war with the United States, openly, on the record, at personal risk. In 1941, when Japan's military leadership was pushing toward war, Yamamoto told the Prime Minister directly, if Japan fought America for 6 months, they might win. If the war lasted longer than that, he could not guarantee anything. He said this because he had been to America. He had seen the factories, he had driven through the oil fields of Texas, he had watched American workers build things at a scale Japan could not match. He knew what this country could produce when it decided it needed to produce something. His superiors overruled him. The war began, and Yamamoto, loyal to his navy and his emperor, planned the attack on Pearl Harbor with the same cold precision he brought to everything. He delivered Japan its greatest victory. And he spent the months afterward waiting for the part he had always known was coming. The American response. In the weeks before the raid, Yamamoto wrote to close friends about his unease. He told them the people celebrating were wrong. Their sense of safety was borrowed, not earned. He put it simply. The fact that the enemy hasn't come is no thanks to us. It is thanks to the enemy himself. He raised this with the Naval General Staff. He suggested a carrier strike on the home islands was possible. They reviewed the same numbers every other strategist had reviewed. Impossible, they said. Yamamoto let the matter drop. 2 weeks later, 16 B-25s appeared over Tokyo. The report his staff handed him that evening was 12 pages long. It contained conflicting accounts of how many planes had attacked, conflicting accounts of what direction they had come from, conflicting accounts of what type of aircraft they were, and at the bottom, a single line from the intelligence section. Point of origin, unknown. Yamamoto read that line. He already knew what it meant. It did not mean the intelligence section had failed to find the answer. It meant the answer did not exist within the boundaries of what Japanese military planning considered possible. The planes had come from somewhere that was not on any of their maps, not because the location was secret, because the method had never been conceived of. He set the report down. He thought about what he had written to his friends. He had been right, and being right in this particular way was its own kind of devastation. Yamamoto later wrote about the raid. He did not write with anger. He wrote, "It is a disgrace that the skies over the imperial capital should have been defiled without a single enemy plane being shot down." Read that sentence carefully. He is not lamenting the damage. The damage was minor, and he knew it. He is not lamenting the deaths. The casualties were small. He is lamenting the sky itself, the sky over Tokyo, over the emperor, over the palace, over everything the Japanese military existed to protect, had been entered by the enemy, and his navy had not stopped it, had not even scratched it. In the culture of the Imperial Japanese Navy, where honor was not a value but a structure, where failure to protect the emperor was not a setback but a personal stain that could not be removed, That sentence carried a weight that no Westerner reading it can fully appreciate. His chief of staff, Admiral Matome Ugaki, sat at his own desk that evening. He opened his diary. Ugaki was not a sentimental man. He was a strategist, a planner, a man who dealt in facts and outcomes. He wrote, "Today, the victory belongs to the enemy." Not, "Today was a difficult day." Not, "Today we suffered a setback." The victory belongs to the enemy. Past tense. Settled. Without qualification or appeal. The chief of staff of the most powerful naval force in the Pacific had just written in his own hand that on this day, in this contest, the other side had won. Inside the Imperial Navy's high command, the raid broke something that had not broken at Pearl Harbor or at Singapore or at the fall of the Philippines. It broke their certainty. Until April 18, 1942, Japan's military leaders had operated from a foundation of known quantities. They knew the range of American aircraft. They knew the locations of American bases. They knew what the Americans could do, and, more importantly, what they could not. After April 18th, they did not know any of those things anymore. If a medium bomber could take off from a carrier, something every man in that room had considered physically impossible, then what else had they calculated wrong? What other impossibilities were the Americans already planning? The Japanese government moved quickly to control the public story. Newspapers reported the attack as a minor nuisance, a few planes, minimal damage, enemy pilots attempting to terrorize civilians and failing. The word Doolittle was translated mockingly as "do nothing." Radio Tokyo broadcast reassurances, but the men who ran the war knew the truth. They had been inside that room when the question was asked and no one could answer it, and they understood in the way that serious military men understand things when they strip away the official statements, that the Americans had just demonstrated they could do something Japan had declared impossible, which meant Japan's entire strategic calculation was now built on a foundation with a crack in it. A crack they could not measure, could not account for, could not plan around, because they still did not know where those 16 planes had come from. That night, on the other side of the world, Jimmy Doolittle was not in a command center. He was not reading intelligence reports. He was in a muddy field in Zhejiang province in China, sitting next to the wreckage of his B-25, which had run out of fuel and gone down in the dark. He had bailed out at 5,000 feet into rain and fog so thick he could not see the ground until he hit it. He had landed hard, picked himself up, found some of his crew, spent the night in a farmhouse whose owner did not speak English and had no idea what was happening. Doolittle sat in the dark and thought about the 16 planes he had left Japan with. Every single one of them was gone, crashed, ditched, scattered across eastern China. Not one had made it to the planned airfield. He had lost an entire squadron of aircraft. He had inflicted, by his own reckoning, minimal damage on the enemy. He told one of his crew that night that he expected to face a military tribunal when he got home. He was not being dramatic. He genuinely believed it. The man who had just changed the course of the Pacific War went to sleep in a Chinese farmhouse convinced he had failed. Before the Doolittle Raid, Japan's senior admirals were fighting two wars at the same time, one against the Allies, one against each other. Admiral Yamamoto had been pushing the Naval General Staff toward a single objective since January 1942. He wanted to destroy the American carrier fleet, not damage it, not push it back, destroy it, permanently, so that it could never again threaten Japanese waters. His plan was to seize Midway Island, a tiny atoll 1,200 miles northwest of Hawaii. Midway was bait. Yamamoto believed that if Japan threatened Midway, the Americans would have no choice but to send their carriers to defend it, and when they did, he would be waiting with the largest naval force ever assembled in the Pacific. 4 fleet carriers, battleships, cruisers, hundreds of aircraft. The Americans would come, and he would end the carrier war in a single afternoon. The Naval General Staff was not convinced. They had a different plan. They wanted to push southeast, cut the supply lines between America and Australia, seize the Fiji Islands, New Caledonia, Samoa, strangle Australia into neutrality without ever having to invade it. It was, in its own way, a sound strategy. The two camps had been arguing about this for months. Yamamoto had the stronger personality. The General Staff had the institutional authority. Neither side had yet prevailed. Then April 18th happened. When the smoke cleared over Tokyo and the unanswerable questions settled into the war rooms, the debate ended. Not because Yamamoto won the argument, because the argument no longer existed. The Naval General Staff had spent months insisting that the American carrier force was a manageable threat, something to be neutralized eventually on Japan's own timetable. After 16 B-25s appeared over the Emperor's capital, that position was indefensible. Every objection the General Staff had raised against the Midway plan dissolved in the same moment the bombs fell. Within days of the raid, the Naval General Staff gave Yamamoto everything he asked for: full commitment to Midway, the largest carrier force Japan had ever assembled, the decisive battle he had been demanding for months. Yamamoto had not changed their minds. Doolittle had done it for him. The first consequence was immediate. Japan pulled 4 full fighter groups out of the Pacific combat zones and stationed them in the home islands. These were not reserve units. These were experienced pilots, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean campaign, men who had been flying combat missions for months. They were brought home to defend Tokyo against the next raid that everyone now agreed was coming. Those 4 groups stayed in Japan through 1942 and into 1943, sitting on airfields, waiting for American bombers that did not come back. While they waited, the battles that would decide the war were being fought in the Solomon Islands and the waters around Guadalcanal with whatever air power Japan had left. The arithmetic of that absence showed up in every engagement that followed. The second consequence took 6 weeks to arrive. On the 4th of June, 1942, the Japanese carrier strike force approached Midway Atoll. Yamamoto's plan was in motion. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, hundreds of aircraft, the finest naval aviators Japan had ever trained. What Yamamoto did not know was that American cryptanalysts had broken the Japanese naval code. Admiral Nimitz knew the attack was coming. He knew the date. He knew the force composition. He positioned 3 American carriers in ambush northeast of Midway, outside the range of Japanese search planes. The Japanese launched their strike against the island, while their aircraft were away from the carriers, rearming on the flight decks for a second wave. American dive bombers found the fleet. In the space of a few catastrophic minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were hit, set ablaze, and abandoned. Hiryu survived the initial attack, launched a counterstrike that badly damaged the USS Yorktown, and was then found and destroyed by a second American wave later that afternoon. 4 carriers, gone in a single day, along with their aircraft, along with their pilots, along with the irreplaceable pool of experience those men had accumulated over years of training and combat. Japan could build new carriers. It could not build new men who knew how to fly off a carrier deck at night, or land on one in heavy weather, or read the wind and the sea the way those pilots could. That knowledge went down with the ships. And it never came back. Yamamoto had wanted the decisive battle. He got it. It just did not go the way he had drawn it, and it would not have happened at all. Not at Midway, not in June 1942, not before Japan was ready. If 16 B-25s had not appeared over Tokyo on a Saturday morning in April and left behind a question nobody could answer. The raid gave Yamamoto his argument. The argument gave him Midway. Midway gave the Americans the Pacific. All of it. Traced back to 80 men and a crack in the foundation of what Japan believed was possible. There is one more consequence. It is the one that gets left out of most histories of the Doolittle Raid. When the B-25s crossed into China after leaving Japan, most crews had no choice but to bail out or crash land in the provinces of Zhejiang and Jiangxi. They came down in fields, on hillsides, in rivers, and the Chinese civilians who found them did what people do when they find frightened, injured strangers who are fighting on your side. They hid them. They fed them. They guided them toward friendly lines, sometimes walking for days through Japanese-occupied territory to do it. Most of the raiders survived because of those people. When the Japanese military learned that Chinese villagers had sheltered the American crews, they launched a reprisal operation across the provinces where the planes had come down. It lasted for months. When it was over, an estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians were dead. Villages burned, wells poisoned. Entire communities erased in retaliation for the crime of helping men who had come from nowhere and could not stay. 250,000 people, for 16 planes, 80 men, 30 seconds over Tokyo. That number does not appear on most of the monuments. It does not come up in most of the celebrations, but it is part of what the raid cost. And anyone who wants to understand what happened on April 18, 1942, has to hold both things at the same time: what the raid accomplished, and what it cost people who had no say in any of it. Jimmy Doolittle spent 3 days getting out of China. He made his way from safe house to safe house, guided by Chinese soldiers and civilians who risked their lives to move him through territory that Japanese troops were already entering in search of the American crews. He eventually reached Chongqing, then India, then Washington. He arrived home in May 1942 carrying something heavier than the mission itself, the conviction that he had failed. He had lost every plane. All 16 B-25s were gone. 3 men had died in the crash landings and bailouts across China. 8 men had been captured by Japanese forces. Of those 8, 3 would be executed by firing squad. 1 would die of illness in captivity. The remaining 4 survived to be liberated in August 1945. Doolittle ran these numbers in his head the entire way home. 16 aircraft destroyed, minimal damage to the enemy, American prisoners in Japanese hands. He sat down and composed his thoughts the way an engineer composes a failure analysis. He listed what had gone wrong. He listed what he would do differently. He prepared himself for the questions he assumed were coming. He told a colleague he expected to be reduced in rank. That is not a figure of speech. He meant it. What he did not know, what no one in his position could have known, was what his mission had already set in motion in the war rooms of Tokyo. He did not know about the closed door. He did not know about Ugaki's diary. He did not know that the Naval General Staff had abandoned months of strategic argument within days of his bombs falling. He did not know that 4 fighter groups had been pulled from the Pacific and parked in Japan. He did not know that Yamamoto had just received approval for the Midway operation that would end Japan's offensive capability for the rest of the war. He knew none of it. He knew only what he could see: 16 wrecked planes, men unaccounted for, a mission that had lasted 30 seconds over Tokyo and cost everything he had brought with him. President Roosevelt received him at the White House in May. Roosevelt had already decided what the raid meant for the American public. He had been asked by the press where the planes had come from. He smiled. He said they had come from Shangri-La. It was a reference to a popular novel about a hidden paradise in the mountains of Asia. The press loved it. The public loved it. America needed something to love in the spring of 1942. The news from the Pacific had been almost unbroken disaster since December. Wake Island, Bataan, the fall of the Philippines. 80,000 American and Filipino soldiers marched into Japanese captivity. Into that darkness, 16 planes had appeared over Tokyo. That was enough. That was more than enough. Roosevelt awarded Doolittle the Medal of Honor. He promoted him not 1 grade, but 2. From lieutenant colonel straight to brigadier general, skipping the rank of colonel entirely. Doolittle stood in the White House and told Roosevelt he did not deserve it. He was not being modest. He still believed, genuinely, that the mission had been a failure. Roosevelt disagreed, and history, as it turned out, agreed with Roosevelt. While Doolittle was standing in the White House trying to explain why he should not receive a medal, Admiral Yamamoto was in his cabin aboard the Yamato reviewing the final operational plans for Midway. 2 men, 2 rooms, 1 month apart, one being honored for something he did not believe he had accomplished, one preparing to respond to that accomplishment with the largest naval force Japan had ever assembled. Yamamoto understood what Midway needed to be. It needed to be final. The question that had been hanging over the Japanese High Command since April 18th. Where did those planes come from, and when are they coming back? Could only be answered one way, by destroying the carriers that had launched them. Sink the American carriers. End the question. Restore the perimeter. Restore the certainty. He committed 4 fleet carriers to the operation. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. The finest aircrew Japan had, the most experienced carrier pilots in the world. He was so confident in the plan that he brought the entire combined fleet. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, more than 200 ships in total. It was not a battle plan. It was a closing argument. Yamamoto lost. The details of how he lost belong to a different story. What belongs to this one is simpler. He went to Midway because of 16 B-25s. He assembled that armada because a question had no answer, and the question had to be silenced. He lost 4 carriers, hundreds of irreplaceable pilots, and Japan's ability to prosecute an offensive war in the Pacific because the only cure he could imagine for what Doolittle had done was a decisive battle. And the decisive battle destroyed him. Roosevelt's medal, Yamamoto's fleet. One man received an honor he said he did not deserve. One man launched a war he could not afford to lose. Both of them were responding to the same 30 seconds over the same city on the same April morning. The difference was this. Doolittle went to Tokyo not knowing if he would survive. Yamamoto went to Midway not knowing he had already lost. History is sometimes that clean. In April 2019, a 93-year-old man named Richard Cole died quietly in Texas. He had been a co-pilot. He sat in the right seat of the lead B-25 on April 18, 1942, 2 feet to Jimmy Doolittle's right. He was the last of the 80 raiders. When Richard Cole died, the living memory of what it felt like to sit on that flight deck and wait for the signal. The smell of the salt air and the aviation fuel, the sound of the engines turning over in the rain, the way the deck moved under you as the carrier climbed and fell through the swells. All of that ended. It does not exist anywhere anymore except in what was written down. What was written down includes a page from the diary of Admiral Matome Ugaki, April 18, 1942. 7 words. Today, the victory belongs to the enemy. Ugaki did not know the man he was writing about. He did not know Doolittle's name until later. He did not know about the tin can fuel tanks, or the 20-cent bomb site, or the 8 men sitting in Japanese prisons, or the tribunal Doolittle was preparing himself to face. He knew only the result. 16 planes had come from nowhere. His navy had not stopped them. His admiral had closed the door to his cabin, and the enemy had won the day. There are monuments to the Doolittle Raiders. There is a museum. There are plaques. There is a set of silver goblets, one for each of the 80 men, that the survivors used to toast their fallen colleagues at reunions every year until the last of them were gone. When a raider died, his goblet was turned upside down. By the time Richard Cole died in 2019, all 80 goblets were upside down. None of that is what this story is about. This story is about a question. 16 planes appeared over Tokyo and disappeared into China, and no one in the Imperial Japanese High Command could explain where they had come from. That question cost Japan 4 carriers at Midway. It cost Japan 4 fighter groups standing guard over empty skies while the real war moved south. It ended the argument inside Japanese High Command and handed Yamamoto the plan that would be his undoing. And the man responsible for all of it was lying awake in China that first night, not feeling like a man who had changed the war, feeling like a man who owed his country an explanation. The enemy wrote that explanation for him, in 7 words, in a diary, on the night it happened.
June 4th, 1942. 10:22 in the morning. Three of the most powerful aircraft carriers in the Imperial Japanese Navy are on fire. Aboard the Akagi, Japan's flagship, the pride of their fleet, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo receives the reports one after another. Akagi, hit. Kaga, hit. Soryu, hit. In the span of a few minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers have been dealt a fatal blow. The 4th, the Hiryu, is still out there. She is already preparing her counterstrike. But Nagumo, standing among the reports, is not thinking about the Hiryu. He doesn't understand what just happened to the other 3. And he doesn't understand why. Not because he lacked information, not because the Americans had prepared better than he expected, but because of a single sentence, written in the dark hours of that same morning, before a single shot had been fired, that no one on his staff had ever questioned. After the war, that sentence appeared in Japan's internal battle records. Then someone removed it. One of Nagumo's own officers, the man responsible for compiling the official report of the battle, quietly left it out. He never told the historians. He never told the authors of Japan's official war history series. He carried that omission for 70 years. And then, in 2012, at the end of his life, he finally told a Japanese historian what he had done. According to the Naval War College Review, published by the United States Naval War College, what that sentence contained was the real reason Japan lost the Battle of Midway. We're going to read that sentence today, but first, we need to talk about the man who wrote the version of Midway that you already know, and why even Japan's own historians stopped trusting him decades ago. Here is something most people don't realize. Everything the Western world knows about what happened on the Japanese side at Midway, every book, every documentary, every film, every YouTube video you've ever watched on the subject, traces back to a single source. One man. His name was Mitsuo Fuchida. If that name sounds familiar, it should. Fuchida was the senior air officer who led the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. He was present on the Akagi during the Battle of Midway, and when the war ended, he was one of the very few senior officers who had been at the center of both attacks, and survived to write about them. In 1955, he published a book, Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan. It was translated into English almost immediately. American publishers promoted it. American historians cited it. The 1976 film, Midway, the one with Henry Fonda and Hal Holbrook, drew heavily from his account. For the better part of 5 decades, if you were an American trying to understand what happened on the Japanese side of that battle, Fuchida was your primary source. Most people who've written about Midway in English have built on his account, whether they knew it or not. Now step back for a moment. In 1971, 16 years after Fuchida's book came out, Japan released something called the Senshi Sosho, 102 volumes. It was Japan's official military history of the war, compiled by the Japanese government from internal documents, operational records, and materials that had never been made public. Volume 43 covered the Battle of Midway. It was not translated into English. For decades, 2 versions of the same battle existed side by side, the one Americans were reading, and the one Japan's own historians had produced from their own classified records. They were not the same. Jonathan Parshall spent the better part of 10 years working through Japanese primary sources, documents that had never been used by Western historians writing about the Pacific War. In 2005, he and Anthony Tully published Shattered Sword through the Naval Institute Press. And then, in the spring 2010 edition of the Naval War College Review, the academic journal of the institution that trains America's admirals, Parshall wrote something that is worth reading carefully. He wrote, "Fuchida's impact on the history of the Pacific War has been enormously damaging, in that his elaborations have been parroted for years and handed down as truth on the big screen, on television, and in countless internet chat rooms. That is not a casual opinion from a blogger. That is a trained historian, writing in a peer-reviewed military journal, making a direct and documented case that the foundational account of Midway that Americans have accepted for half a century does not hold up against the Japanese records that actually survived the war. Now, why would Fuchida write something that didn't match Japan's own official documents? Consider the circumstances. He published in 1955. Japan had surrendered 10 years earlier. The Imperial Japanese Navy, an institution that had existed for 70 years, the source of enormous national pride, had been dissolved. The men who served in it had lost. Fuchida wasn't just writing history. He was writing for an audience that had suffered one of the most devastating national humiliations in modern memory. Parshall put it plainly in his research. The goal, he wrote, was to find some sense of national pride that might be regained by revealing some moments of nobility within that defeat. That is not a condemnation. That is a human explanation for why a man shapes a story the way he needs it to be shaped. But the consequence has been that for decades, every American who thought they understood what happened on the Japanese side of Midway was reading a version of events that Japan's own scholars had long since set aside. There is a Japanese official history of the Battle of Midway that most Americans have never had access to. There are internal records, message logs, battle reports compiled in the immediate aftermath of the fighting, documents that tell a different story than the one Fuchida wanted the world to hear. And buried inside one of those documents, in a message log compiled on the morning of June 4th, before the first American bomb fell, is the sentence that was quietly removed, the sentence that one officer carried in silence for 70 years. That's where we're going next. If this is the first time you've heard any of this, you're probably not the only one. If you think someone else should know this story exists, ALIC takes about 1 second and puts it in front of people who've never seen it. 8 days before the battle. May 27th, 1942. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton walks into Admiral Chester Nimitz's office at Pearl Harbor and sets a piece of paper on the desk. On it, he has written the following. The Japanese carriers will attack on the morning of June 4th. They will approach from the northwest on a bearing of 325 degrees. They will be approximately 175 miles from Midway at 7 o'clock in the morning. That's it. Date, direction, distance, time. Nimitz reads it. He doesn't ask for a second opinion. He doesn't wait for Washington to confirm it. He doesn't hedge. He deploys his entire available carrier force, all 3 ships, including the USS Yorktown, which had taken serious damage at the Battle of the Coral Sea less than a month earlier, and had been estimated to need 3 months of repairs. Nimitz told the repair crews at Pearl Harbor they had 3 days. They gave him 72 hours. The Yorktown steamed out of dry dock and headed north to meet the Japanese fleet. On the morning of June 4th, as the first American scout reports began coming in, Nimitz turned to Layton and said, "Well, you were only 5 miles, 5 degrees, and 5 minutes off. 5 miles, 5 degrees, 5 minutes, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Now, how does something like that happen? It doesn't happen by accident. It happens because of a deliberate choice Nimitz made about how he wanted to receive information. The Naval History and Heritage Command, the United States Navy's own historical authority, recorded what Nimitz told Layton when he first took command of the Pacific Fleet, in the weeks after Pearl Harbor. He told Layton that his job was to think like Admiral Yamamoto, not to brief Nimitz on what was happening, not to summarize intercepts, not to tell him what the intelligence said, to think like the enemy commander, to get inside his head and tell Nimitz what Yamamoto was going to do next, even when the evidence was incomplete, even when Washington disagreed, even when being wrong would mean career consequences for everyone in the room. That is a very specific thing to ask of an intelligence officer. It means the job is not to confirm. It means the job is to challenge. And Nimitz built his entire pre-battle planning around that principle. According to Proceedings, the flagship journal of the United States Naval Institute, Nimitz and his staff did not simply accept intelligence estimates at face value. They made a deliberate effort to understand the tradecraft behind the estimates they were receiving. Washington, at that same moment, was telling Nimitz he was wrong. The army on Oahu believed the Japanese were coming back to hit Pearl Harbor again. Naval intelligence in Washington thought the attack would fall somewhere in the South Pacific, possibly Australia, possibly the Aleutians. Nimitz listened to all of it. And then he trusted the two men who had spent years living in Japan, learning the language, studying the culture, and reading Yamamoto's communications with their own eyes. Rochefort and Layton, not because they told him what he wanted to hear, because he understood exactly how they had reached their conclusions. There is one more thing worth knowing about how Nimitz operated. In the spring of 1942, Commander Joseph Rochefort, the head of Station Hypo, the Navy's signals intelligence unit at Pearl Harbor, came to Nimitz with an unusual proposal. The Americans were almost certain that the Japanese target was Midway Island, referred to in Japanese communications only by the code letters AF. Almost certain, but not certain enough. Rochefort proposed a test. He would have the garrison at Midway broadcast an unencrypted message, completely open for anyone to hear, reporting that their freshwater distillation plant had broken down. If the Japanese were planning to hit Midway, their communications would almost certainly reference the water shortage. Nimitz approved it. Within hours, American listening stations intercepted a Japanese transmission reporting that their target, the location designated AF, was running low on fresh water. The identity of the Japanese objective was no longer almost certain. It was confirmed. What Rochefort proposed was a trap built out of information. What Nimitz did was say yes, when a less confident commander might have said, "That's too clever, too risky, too unorthodox." Keep that word in mind. Unorthodox, because on the other side of the Pacific, at almost exactly the same moment, a very different kind of meeting was taking place. And the men in that room were not in the habit of saying yes to ideas that challenged the plan. We need to go back to the beginning of June 4th, not 10:22 in the morning, when the bombs were already falling. Earlier, much earlier, 5:20 in the morning, local time. The Kido Butai, Japan's carrier strike force, is steaming toward Midway in the darkness. The first wave of aircraft has already been launched to attack the island. On the bridge of the Akagi, Air Staff Officer Yoshioka Tadakazu is compiling the morning's operational log. He records the weather, wind speed, sea state, visibility, the bearing and speed of the fleet, standard entries. And then, before moving on, he writes one more line, a single sentence recording the staff's intelligence estimate for the day ahead. The sentence read, "It is calculated that the enemy Kido Butai will not be encountered today." The enemy carrier force will not be encountered today. That was the official assessment of Nagumo's staff at 5:20 in the morning on June 4th, 1942. Less than 5 hours later, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were gone. Now, here is what that sentence is not. It is not a tactical error. It is not a failure of nerve. It is not a decision made under pressure by a man who should have known better. It is something quieter than that, and more consequential. According to the Naval War College Review, Spring 2015, published by the United States Naval War College, that sentence is evidence of something that shaped everything that followed on June 4th. The journal's authors wrote, Nagumo and his staff did not expect, and therefore did not even prepare for, contact with an enemy carrier force on the morning of June 4th. Everything that followed flows from this faulty estimate of the situation. Everything that followed, the rearming of the aircraft, the delays, the confusion on the flight decks, the 40 minutes of indecision that everyone has spent 80 years arguing about. All of it flows from one thing, a staff that went into battle without ever genuinely asking whether American carriers might be waiting for them. Not because the question was impossible, because the question was never asked. Think about what Layton was doing at roughly the same hour on the other side of the Pacific. He was sitting with his charts and his intercepts, building a picture of exactly where the Japanese fleet would be, when it would arrive, and what it would do. He had been asked to think like the enemy. On the Akagi, no one had been asked to think like the Americans. The assessment was not a prediction. It was an assumption. and assumptions, unlike predictions, do not require evidence. They only require confidence. Now we come to the second part of this story. The sentence Yoshioka wrote that morning was included in the raw message log. After the battle, when Yoshioka was assigned the task of compiling the official post-battle report, what historians have since called the Nagumo Report, he made a decision. He left that sentence out. He did not misplace it. He did not forget it. He removed it. The official report that went up the chain of command, the report that would become part of the permanent record of the Imperial Japanese Navy, did not contain the line that said the staff had not expected to find American carriers that morning. And then, decades later, when Japan was compiling its official war history, the Senshi Sosho, the 102-volume series drawn from internal military records, Yoshioka did not tell the historians about it then either. According to the Naval War College Review, the omission was not even disclosed to the writers of the Senshi Sosho. The official history of the war did not know the sentence existed. Yoshioka kept it to himself for 70 years. In 2012, a Japanese historian named Mori Shiro published a book called Midway Kaitsen, Naval Battle of Midway. It contained interviews with surviving participants, some of them released only after the subjects had died. One of the most significant was with Yoshioka himself. In that interview, Yoshioka admitted what he had done. He acknowledged the omission, and he told Mori why. He said he had removed it, in his own words, to protect the Navy's reputation. The Naval War College Review, analyzing his admission, was direct about what the deletion meant, that there had been, among a select group of surviving officers, an understanding about how the defeat at Midway was to be presented to history. The mental unreadiness of the Kido Butai for encountering an American carrier force on the morning of June 4th. That was to be downplayed, suppressed if possible. Instead, the story that would be told was one of misfortune and timing, bad luck, narrow margins, the fog of war, not an assumption that was never challenged, not a staff that went to battle having already decided the Americans wouldn't be there. It is worth pausing here to consider what Yoshioka was actually protecting. By 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy had existed as an institution for 70 years. It had won at Tsushima in 1905. It had surprised the world at Pearl Harbor. Its officers were trained from childhood to believe that the Navy represented something larger than any individual battle. Yoshioka was not protecting himself. He was protecting that. That is not an excuse. It is a fact. And it explains something about why the sentence stayed missing for as long as it did. There is one more layer to this. Japan's own official war history, the Senshi Sosho, Volume 43, contains a finding that sits quietly alongside everything else we've discussed. It concerns the mechanics of what would have had to happen on the Japanese carriers for Nagumo to mount any kind of response, even if he had received a warning in time. The Senshi Sosho states that the procedure for bringing aircraft up from the hangars, positioning them on the flight deck, arming them, fueling them, and preparing them for launch would have taken, at minimum, 40 minutes. 40 minutes. Even if Nagumo had known, even if the question had been asked, even if someone on his staff had looked at the intelligence that morning and said, "Wait." The carriers couldn't have responded in time. Which means the problem was not just one sentence in a morning log. It was a system, built entirely around the assumption that surprise would always belong to Japan. A system with no contingency for the morning, it didn't. Now consider the 40 minutes of decisions that everyone has spent decades arguing about. Between 7:15 and roughly 8 o'clock that morning, Nagumo received 3 separate pieces of contradictory information in less than an hour. At 7:15, he ordered his reserve aircraft to swap their torpedoes for land attack bombs for a second strike on Midway. His scout planes had reported no American ships in the area. At 7:28, one of his scout planes reported 10 enemy surface ships to the northeast. No carriers mentioned. Nagumo halted the rearming. At 7:45, a follow-up report. One of the ships appeared to be a carrier. Now his flight decks were covered with aircraft in mid-rearm, some with bombs, some with torpedoes, fuel lines running across the deck, ordnance stacked in the open, and his first strike wave was already returning from Midway, low on fuel, needing to land. The Naval War College Review, the same 2015 analysis that identified the deleted sentence, makes a point that is easy to miss in the decades of criticism directed at Nagumo. It states that his decisions, given the information he had at each moment, were not unreasonable. Each individual choice, viewed in isolation, had a logic to it. The problem was not that Nagumo made bad decisions under pressure. The problem was that he was making decisions inside a situation that his own staff's morning assessment had told him would never exist. He was improvising inside a scenario that his command had already concluded was impossible. The sentence that said the American carriers would not be encountered today, that sentence set the frame for everything. It was written at 5:20 in the morning, removed from the record after the battle, hidden from Japan's own historians for 3 decades, and according to the officer who removed it, speaking at the end of his life to a historian who was willing to listen, it was the real reason Japan lost the Battle of Midway. The question worth asking is this: where did that assumption come from? The one written into the morning log. The one that said the Americans wouldn't be there. It didn't appear on June 4th. It was built, carefully, methodically, 5 weeks earlier, May 1st through May 4th, 1942. Aboard the battleship Yamato, anchored at Hashirajima, the most powerful warship ever constructed, Yamamoto's personal flagship, the senior commanders of the Imperial Japanese Navy gathered for a tabletop war game. The formal purpose was to stress test the Midway plan before committing the fleet to it. Find the weaknesses, challenge the assumptions, work out what could go wrong. That was the purpose. What actually happened was something different. On the second day of the exercise, the officer commanding the simulated American forces sent a flight of land-based bombers from Midway Island to attack the Japanese carrier group. The dice were thrown. The result: 9 hits on the Japanese carriers. By the rules of the exercise, that meant 2 carriers were sunk. Akagi and Kaga, the same 2 carriers that would lead the actual attack, were ruled destroyed. The chief umpire of the exercise was Rear Admiral Ugaki Matome, Yamamoto's own chief of staff. Ugaki looked at the result, and then he set it aside. He reduced the number of hits from 9 to 3. Under his revised ruling, Kaga was still sunk. But Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, the ship where Yoshioka would sit down 5 weeks later to write his morning log, Akagi survived. The exercise continued. Later, in the portion of the game covering the operations that would follow Midway, even Kaga quietly reappeared, restored to the Japanese order of battle, as if her earlier sinking had never occurred. Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully, in Shattered Sword, described the 4 days of exercises as a mockery of professional staff work. The Naval History and Heritage Command, the official historical authority of the United States Navy, recorded what happened when the American player attempted something more realistic. At one point during the exercise, the officer playing the American side positioned his carriers to the north of Midway and launched a strike from an unexpected angle. The attack worked. It worked the same way the real American attack would work, 5 weeks later, in almost exactly the same location. The Naval History and Heritage Command noted that his actions were ruled impossible by the umpire, and the Japanese game losses were restored. His name is not recorded in any document that has survived the war. He played the Americans correctly. He was told that wasn't how the Americans would fight, and the planning session moved on. There was one more moment worth knowing about. During the planning meetings that accompanied the exercise, Vice Admiral Kondo Nobutak, commander of the Second Fleet, one of the most senior officers present, asked a direct question. If Japan captured Midway, how would the island be resupplied? The atoll was more than 1,000 miles from the nearest major Japanese base. Keeping it supplied would require a sustained logistical effort that the Navy had not fully planned for. Yamamoto's own chief of staff acknowledged that resupply might not be possible. The question hung in the air for a moment. No one pursued it. Vice Admiral Nagumo, who would command the carrier strike force, said nothing. He had reason to stay quiet. Yamamoto had criticized him sharply for not ordering a third strike at Pearl Harbor, for pulling back when Yamamoto believed he should have pressed. The relationship between the two men was strained. Nagumo was not in a position to challenge the plan. The meeting ended. The plan was approved as written. Kondo's question and the Chief of Staff's answer did not appear in the meeting record. Now hold that image. A planning session aboard the most powerful ship in the world. A war game where unfavorable results were revised until they came out right. An officer who played the Americans correctly and was told his moves were impossible. A direct question about a fatal flaw in the plan that was acknowledged, then dropped, then left out of the record. And then come back to Pearl Harbor. Same weeks, same month, different room. Nimitz is telling Leighton that his job, his only job, is to think like the enemy, not to confirm, to challenge. Rochefort is in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters, working through intercepts, and coming to Nimitz with ideas that sound, on their face, unorthodox, like sending a fake message about broken water equipment to trap the Japanese into revealing their own target. And Nimitz is saying yes. There are no umpires overruling the results in the basement of Station Hypo. There is no senior officer adjusting the dice rolls until the outcome matches the plan. The two rooms are not that far apart in time. They are separated by an ocean, and by something harder to measure. On the morning of June 4th, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey is flying at 20,000 feet over an empty stretch of the Pacific Ocean. He is the air group commander of the USS Enterprise. He has been in the air for nearly 2 hours. His fuel is running low. The Japanese fleet is not where it was supposed to be. Nagumo had changed course that morning, the result of evasive maneuvering under repeated American attacks from Midway, and the Kido Butai was no longer where it was expected to be. McCluskey reaches the estimated point of interception and finds nothing. He has no updated position report, no new orders from the Enterprise, no way to know where the Japanese have gone. He has a decision to make. He could turn back. His fuel situation was becoming critical. Every minute of additional searching increased the risk that he and his pilots would run dry before they could land. He chose to keep searching. He extended his flight to the southwest, then turned north, a calculated guess about where the Japanese carriers might have gone. 20 minutes later, he saw something below him, a single Japanese destroyer steaming at full speed toward the northeast. The ship was the Arashi. She had spent the morning attacking the American submarine USS Nautilus, which had been harassing the Japanese fleet, and was now racing to rejoin the main formation. McCluskey watched her bow cut through the water, pointing like an arrow. He followed it. At 10 o'clock in the morning, he spotted the wakes of the Japanese carriers. 22 minutes later, at 10:22, his dive bombers rolled into their attack runs. Nimitz later described McCluskey's decision, the choice to keep searching, to extend the flight, to follow the destroyer, as having decided the fate of our carrier task force and our forces at a Midway. That is not a small thing to say about one man's choice on a morning when everything was uncertain. McCluskey had no orders for that situation. No one had told him what to do if the Japanese weren't where they were supposed to be. He made a judgment call. And it worked. That afternoon, dive bombers from the Enterprise located the Hiryu and left her burning without the ability to launch aircraft. She was scuttled the following morning. By June 5th, all 4 Japanese carriers were gone. What happened next is less often told. Before the surviving Japanese ships had even returned to port at Hashirajima, before the fleet had anchored on June 14th, senior Navy officers were already discussing how the battle would be presented. Jonathan Parshall, writing in Naval History magazine in 2007, documented what followed. The official announcement to the Japanese public described Midway as a victory. 2 American carriers had been sunk, it said. Japan had prevailed. The Akagi and the Hiryu, both at the bottom of the Pacific, were kept on the Navy's official roster, listed not as sunk, listed as unmanned. Sailors who had been wounded at Midway were separated from the general hospital population. They were not allowed to communicate with their families. They were not permitted to tell anyone what had happened. Not a single admiral was relieved of command. Not Yamamoto. Not Nagumo. The institution closed around the defeat the way water closes around a stone, and Yoshioka, sitting down sometime after the battle to compile the official report, made his own small contribution to that effort. He removed a sentence. One sentence. The one that would have shown, in the Navy's own words, written by one of its own officers, at 5:20 in the morning before a single shot had been fired, that the staff of the Kido Butai had already decided the Americans wouldn't be there. On the morning of June 4th, as the first scout reports confirmed that the Japanese fleet was exactly where Leighton said it would be, Nimitz turned to his intelligence officer and said, "Well, you were only 5 miles, 5 degrees, and 5 minutes off." Leighton had told him the fleet would be 175 miles from Midway. It was 180. He had said bearing 325 degrees. It was 320. He had said 7 o'clock in the morning. It was 5 minutes past. 5 miles. 5 degrees. 5 minutes. In the middle of an ocean that covers a third of the Earth's surface. That is what it looks like when an institution builds a system designed to find the truth. Even when the truth is inconvenient. Even when Washington disagrees. Even when the answer changes the plan entirely. On the other side of that ocean, an institution built a system designed to protect the plan, even when the war game said it would fail. Even when an officer asked a question that had no comfortable answer. Even when the morning log recorded an assumption that the enemy would simply not appear. The assumption was wrong, and the man who wrote it down spent the rest of his life making sure no one would know. Yoshioka kept quiet for 70 years. A lot of the men who were actually there did the same thing. If someone in your family served in the Pacific, what did they tell you about it? Or what did they never talk about? Those silences say something too. Leave it in the comments. I'm asking because I genuinely want to know. July 23rd, 1945. Patience Bay on the east coast of Sakhalin Island. Japanese territory, 12:40 in the morning. 2 rubber boats sit low in black water, 950 yards off the coast of Imperial Japan. Behind them, in the dark, a submarine waits with empty torpedo tubes. 8 men are paddling toward the beach. None of them are Marines. One is a ship's cook. One is a torpedoman, who as a boy, used to crack walnuts by laying them on a railroad track and letting a passing train do the work for him. That trick is now wired to 55 pounds of explosives buried under a Japanese rail line. In about 90 seconds, a train is going to come down those tracks. These 8 men are going to still be in the water when it does. What happens next was written down in a War Patrol report, filed away, and almost forgotten for 80 years. If you think stories like this deserve to be remembered, hit like before we go any further. It genuinely helps more of them find the people who still care. Here's what actually happened that night. By the 3rd week of July 1945, the USS Barb had nothing left to prove. 6 months earlier, off the coast of China, she found more than 30 Japanese ships anchored together. A harbor too shallow, too narrow, too heavily mined for any submarine to enter. Her commander, Eugene Fluckey, took her in. 6 torpedoes from the bow tubes. 4 more from the stern as she turned to escape. 3 ships sunk. 3 more left burning. Then an hour at full speed through uncharted, rock-studded water to get back out alive. For that night, Fluckey received the Medal of Honor. The crew already had a name for him. Lucky Fluckey. It had nothing to do with caution. It was about how often the things he risked turned out fine. By the time the war ended, Barb would be credited with the 3rd highest tonnage of any American submarine in the war. 96,000 tons, 17 ships, on the bottom of the ocean. Patrol 12 was supposed to add little to that. She had already fired every torpedo she carried. What was left? A deck gun, a rack of rockets bolted to her hull, and a crew that had spent 11 patrols learning that quiet rarely lasted long in the Sea of Okhotsk. Fog sat on the water most mornings and didn't burn off until midday. The current ran cold, even in July, and the coastline belonged to an enemy who had held it for 40 years, who knew every inch of it better than any chart Barb carried. In the weeks before, they used what they had. Tugs and small fishing boats along the coast of Hokkaido, sunk by gunfire. Then, off a stretch of Karafuto's coast the charts called Kaihio, Seal Island, Barb fired her rockets at the buildings on shore. No submarine had ever used rockets against a target on land before. This was the first. By any normal measure, the patrol was already a success. On July 19th, off Patience Bay, on the eastern shore of an island the Japanese called Karafuto, Flucky raised a periscope for a routine look at the shore. What he saw was a railroad. It ran along the coastline, close enough to the water that a man standing on the beach could almost reach out and touch a passing train. Smoke rising from locomotives, freight cars, passenger cars, a mail car, moving on a schedule as if there were no war at all. For 3 days, Flucky kept the scope up. He timed the trains, noted which direction they ran, how often, how close the tracks sat to the water, where the curves were, where a man could get near them without being seen from a window. A submarine cannot fire a torpedo at a train. There's nothing in a Gato-class boat's arsenal built to hit something sitting on land, between mountains on one side and shallow water on the other. Flucky knew that. He kept watching. On the third day, with the scope still up, he said something out loud. To no one in particular, the way a man talks when he thinks he's alone. Now there's a target I'd like to blow up. He wasn't alone. The man standing closest to him was Paul Saunders. Swish, the crew called him. The same railroad Flucky had spent 3 days. Watching through a periscope, the same 1-8 men had just walked 1,000 yards through reeds to reach. By 1945, that railroad was carrying coal from the interior, fish from the coastal towns, and people back and forth, the way any railroad does, in a place that 40 years to get used to one. By the summer of 1945, the war had reached almost every part of the Japanese Empire in one form or another. But Karafuto sat at the northern edge of it, far from the island-hopping campaigns in the south, far from the cities being targeted by long-range bombers. What military attention it did receive was pointed north, toward the land border with Soviet territory. Not east, toward an empty stretch of coastline and the sea beyond it. 3 weeks after Barb's demolition party climbed back into their boats, that border would matter. The Soviet Union would invade Karafuto from the north, tens of thousands of troops, crossing a line that had held since 1905, as part of its declaration of war against Japan in the closing days of the conflict. But on the night of July 23rd, none of that had happened yet. On the night of July 23rd, the only foreign footprints on 40 years of Japanese soil belonged to 8 American sailors, a cook, a torpedoman, a handful of men from the engine room and the deck, who hadn't come across that northern border at all. They had come out of the sea, on a stretch of coast nobody was watching, carrying a bomb built in an engine room from spare steel and a few feet of wire. 40 years untouched, and then for one night it wasn't. 3 weeks later the war was over. For the 8 men who'd walked that beach, recognition came fast. Lieutenant Walker received the Navy Cross. The other 7, Saunders, Hatfield, and the rest, each received the Silver Star. Barb carried something home too. Submarines marked their war patrols on their battle flags, small symbols, painted on. One for each ship sunk, each target destroyed. A kind of scoreboard that came home with the crew. On Barb's flag, alongside all of that, was a symbol no other submarine in the United States Navy carried, a locomotive. That flag still hangs today in a submarine museum where anyone can walk up and see it. Most of what's known about that night comes from one place. Flucky's own memoir, written decades later, called Thunder Below. Without it, the details of who climbed which tower, who fell into which ditch, and who stood over Hatfield's shoulder in the dark might never have been written down anywhere at all. For Flucky, the war's end wasn't the end of his career. It was closer to the middle of it. He stayed in the Navy for almost 3 decades after that night in Patience Bay. He commanded other submarines. He held posts in Washington, and from 1966 to 1968, more than 20 years after standing on a submarine's deck watching a Japanese train fly into the air. Rear Admiral Eugene Flucky served as Director of Naval Intelligence, the officer responsible for understanding what every other navy in the world was doing, and why. The man who once spent 3 days with a periscope up, learning a train schedule on the other side of the world, spent 2 years of the Cold War doing something not so different, at a much larger scale, for a country that, by then, mostly forgotten what he'd done to earn the right to do it. For decades, that's about where this story stayed, in Navy records, in a memoir, in the memory of a handful of families. It's easy to see why it never went much further. It doesn't fit the shape most war stories take. There was no battle, no ships exchanging fire, no beach assault, no flag raised over anything. 8 men went ashore. 8 men came back. The only thing that didn't survive the night was a train, too small for a campaign, too strange for a textbook, the kind of story that falls through the cracks between the battles everyone already knows. But maybe that's exactly why it's worth telling, because nothing about that night came from the biggest ship, or the newest weapon, or a plan drawn up by someone with a war college education. It came from a chief who didn't ask questions before going to get a map. A torpedoman who remembered a game from when he was a kid. 2 machinists with a torch and some scrap steel from the engine room. And 6 other men who raised their hands when asked. No questions. No hesitation. None of them set out to make history. They set out to dig a hole, bury something in it, and get back to the boat before the next train came. For one night, on a stretch of coastline that had belonged to Japan for 40 years, and had never once seen an enemy, that was enough. These 8 names survived because one man eventually sat down and wrote them into a book. Most of the men who fought that war came home and didn't talk about it much. The ones who did usually picked the parts that made for a good story at a reunion. Not the parts that kept them up at night. Somewhere in between those 2 kinds of silence are stories like this one. Strange enough to tell, ordinary enough that the men who lived it never thought it was worth writing down themselves. If your father, or your grandfather, served somewhere in the Pacific, there's a decent chance he came home with a story, a little like this one. Not in his official record, not in any book. The kind that came out late one night or once at Thanksgiving, told a little reluctantly, the way men of that generation told most things. The kind that started with, "You wouldn't believe this one," and left the table a little quieter once it was done. If you've got a story like that, something you heard from a father, a grandfather, an uncle, that never made it into any history book, write it down here in the comments. Not for us, for it, so it doesn't disappear the way this one almost did.
October 25th, 1944, Surigao Strait, Philippines. In the pitch-black veil of the largest naval battle in history, USS West Virginia, a 21-year-old American battleship, once sunk at Pearl Harbor, detects the Japanese fleet at an unimaginable distance. 44,000 yards, over 21 nautical miles. No moonlight to guide, no optical sights piercing the darkness, just a secret radar system sweeping the horizon. She locks on to the Japanese battleship Yamashiro, opens fire at 22,800 yards. Each shell, weighing 2,700 pounds, arcs through the night sky for more than 30 seconds. In that time, the target steams ahead 400 yards. No digital computers, no satellite guidance, just an analog fire control system, optical backups, and radar plotting the enemy's every move. The first salvo strikes true. It rips through the superstructure, ignites fires that rage across decks, and cripples the Japanese vessel. Her speed drops from 20 knots to a staggering crawl. Teamed with other American ships, Yamashiro sinks in just 15 minutes, dragging the cruiser Mogami down with her. This hit, at 22,800 yards, stands as one of the longest direct strikes between moving battleships in the Pacific theater, and it marks the final battleship versus battleship clash in history. Yet, this American ship, designed back in 1923, was deemed outdated compared to Japan's super battleship Yamato, armed with 18.1-inch guns, the largest ever built. No new prototypes, no cutting-edge overhauls beyond radar upgrades, just recycled turrets from a bygone era. That is the paradox at the heart of this story. How did an obsolete American battleship from 1923 outgun Japan, the naval powerhouse with the world's mightiest guns. In World War II, the answer starts in the naval arms race of the 1920s, a high-stakes gamble that reshaped the Pacific War. But before we dive deeper, imagine the tension on that bridge. Radar pings echoing, crews holding their breath as shells vanish into the night. One hit changed everything, and it proved that sometimes old iron with new eyes can outsmart the giants. Stay with us as we uncover the full tale. By the 1920s, the naval landscape of the Pacific was a powder keg, fueled by rising tensions between two emerging superpowers, the United States and Japan. Both nations eyed each other warily, building fleets that could dominate the vast ocean expanses. But the aftermath of the First World War brought constraints. In 1922, the Washington Naval Treaty was signed, a pact designed to prevent another arms race like the one that had engulfed Europe. It limited the size and number of battleships for major powers, including America, Britain, and Japan. Under the treaty, the United States was capped at a certain tonnage for capital ships, forcing a halt to new constructions beyond what was already underway. This is where the Colorado-class battleships enter the story. USS West Virginia, commissioned in 1923, was one of the last of this class. A trio that included Colorado and Maryland. Designed during the late 19-teens, these ships carried 8 16-inch guns. In 4 twin turrets, a significant upgrade from the 14-inch weapons of earlier dreadnoughts. At the time, they represented American naval might, displacing 32,600 tons, capable of 21 knots, and armored with up to 13 inches of belt protection. But the treaty froze further advancements. America couldn't build bigger or better without violating the agreement. Japan, however, played a different game. Publicly complying with the treaty, they secretly harbored ambitions for supremacy. By the mid-1930s, Japan had withdrawn from the naval limitations, embarking on a clandestine program to create the ultimate battleship. Enter the Yamato class. Construction began in 1937 on what would become the largest battleships ever built. Yamato and her sister Musashi displaced over 72,000 tons fully loaded, more than twice the size of West Virginia. Their main armament, 9 18.1-inch guns capable of hurling shells over 26 miles. These were monsters of the sea, designed to outrange and outpunch any opponent. Japan poured resources into them, believing that sheer size and firepower would ensure dominance in a decisive fleet battle, a doctrine rooted in their Mahanian philosophy of naval warfare. Meanwhile, America focused on quality over quantity, but the treaty's shadow loomed large. The Colorado class, including West Virginia, seemed adequate in the 1920s, but by the 1930s, intelligence whispers suggested Japan was cheating. American admirals knew they needed an edge, but new builds like the North Carolina class were only just starting, delayed by politics and budgets. Then came the Thunderbolt, December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Japanese carrier planes struck without warning. USS West Virginia, moored in Battleship Row, took the brunt. 7 torpedoes slammed into her port side, and 2 bombs detonated above. She listed heavily, flooding rapidly. 106 crewmen perished, trapped below decks as counterflooding saved her from capsizing. But she settled into the mud, a smoldering wreck. Many thought her finished, an outdated relic claimed by modern air power. Yet, this was no end. It was a resurrection. In May 1942, salvage teams began the Herculean task. They patched holes, pumped out water, and refloated her by June. Towed to Puget Sound Navy Yard, West Virginia underwent a transformation that would redefine her role. From 1943 to 1944, she received a complete modernization. Her superstructure was rebuilt, anti-aircraft batteries multiplied, from a handful to over 100 guns. But the true game changer? Radar. Specifically, the Mark 8 fire control radar, a top-secret American innovation. This wasn't just detection gear. It was a predictive marvel. It could spot targets at 40,000 yards, track their speed and course, and compute firing solutions in real time, accounting for wind, roll, and even shell wear. In the dark or fog, where optical rangefinders failed beyond 20,000 yards, radar pierced through. This upgrade was a gamble. Resources were scarce in wartime. America could have scrapped West Virginia and built newer ships like the Iowa class. But Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, saw potential in revival. If the radar failed, if integration glitches persisted, she'd be a floating liability against Yamato's behemoths. It echoed the bold risks of earlier eras, like Winston Churchill's untested guns in 1912. But the bet paid off. By July 1944, West Virginia steamed back to the Pacific, recommissioned and reborn. Her crew, battle-hardened, dubbed her WWII, a phoenix from Pearl's ashes. Japan, meanwhile, had unleashed Yamato. Commissioned in 1941, she symbolized imperial ambition. Yet, her Achilles heel was technology. Japan lagged in radar development. Their sets were primitive, limited to basic detection, not precise gunnery control. They relied on optical sights, excellent in daylight, useless at night or long range without spotters. As the war turned against Japan, desperation mounted. By October 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf loomed, the largest naval engagement ever. Japan's Shogo Plan, a last-ditch effort to crush American landings in the Philippines. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's Southern Force, including Yamashiro, an older but modernized battleship, would charge through Surigao Strait to link with the center force under Takeo Kurita, spearheaded by Yamato. Their goal, annihilate the invasion fleet. But waiting in the strait was Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's American task force, with West Virginia at the van. The stage was set for a clash, where old met new, and technology trumped tonnage. Oldendorf positioned his ships in the classic crossing the T formation, a tactical masterpiece. As Nishimura's force steamed north, blind in the darkness, American radar lit the way. What followed would prove that West Virginia's revival was no mere salvage job. It was a strategic masterstroke. But to understand how she outgunned the Japanese, we must look closer at the weapons themselves. The technical details reveal why an outdated design, paired with innovation, became unbeatable. Let's dive into the guns, the radar, and the philosophies that separated victors from the vanquished. To understand how West Virginia outgunned the Japanese, we must examine the weapons themselves. The technical specifications reveal why an outdated design from 1923, when paired with cutting-edge innovation, became an unbeatable force. Let's dive into the guns, the radar, and the design philosophies that separated the victors from the vanquished. First, consider the main armament of USS West Virginia. Her primary weapons were 8 16-inch 45 caliber guns, mounted in 4 twin turrets, 2 forward and 2 aft. These were the Mark VII model, an evolution from earlier designs. Each gun weighed about 112 tons, with a bore length of 60 feet. The shells they fired were armor-piercing monsters, 2,700 pounds each, packed with explosive filler. Muzzle velocity clocked in at 2,300 feet per second. On a standard charge, propelled by 540 pounds of smokeless powder. This gave them a maximum range of 23,000 yards, with the original mountings, about 13 nautical miles. But after her 1944 refit, elevations increased to 30 degrees, pushing the range to nearly 24 miles, with streamlined super-heavy shells. Rate of fire was solid, 2 rounds per minute under ideal conditions, with a cycle time as low as 30 seconds in drills. What made these guns exceptional, however, was their reliability and longevity. Each barrel could withstand 250 to 300 full charge equivalents before needing relining, a testament to American engineering's focus on durability. The design philosophy here was straightforward. Launch the heaviest possible shell at a moderate velocity.
Flucky knew that. He kept watching. On the third day, with the scope still up, he said something out loud. To no one in particular, the way a man talks when he thinks he's alone. Now there's a target I'd like to blow up. He wasn't alone. The man standing closest to him was Paul Saunders. Swish, the crew called him. Chief of the boat. 12 patrols on barb, every single one. going back to her first run out of Pearl Harbor. Saunders didn't ask what Flucky meant. He went and got a map, a topographic chart of the Karafuto coastline, the kind that shows elevation, tree lines, the slope of a beach at low tide. He unrolled it across the wardroom table, and for a while the two of them just stood over it, looking at a stretch of Japanese coastline neither of them had ever set foot on. Submarines were built to avoid land, not study it. Every chart aboard Barb existed to keep her away from rocks, shoals, and shorelines, not to help 8 men find their way across one in the dark. The problem was simple to state and hard to solve. You cannot torpedo a train. You cannot shell one without leveling half the coastline and announcing your position to every garrison for 50 miles. The only way to stop a train was to put something on the rails themselves, which meant putting men on the beach. That was when Billy Hatfield spoke up. Growing up, he and his friends had a trick for cracking walnuts. Lay them on the railroad tracks near home. Wait for a train. Let the weight of the locomotive do in seconds what a hammer would take all afternoon to do. A train didn't need to be told to crush something sitting on the rail. It just needed to arrive. So Hatfield sketched it out. A demolition charge, buried beneath the track. A pressure switch resting on the rail itself, wired to the charge, with one connection left to make by hand. Once it was in the ground, no timer to set, no detonator to trigger from a distance, no one crouched in the bushes with a thumb on a plunger. The train would do it. Every time. Simply by arriving, Flucky called it. They would build the device, get it ashore, bury it under the rail, and be back aboard Barb before the next train ever reached it. Then came the harder question. Who was going ashore? Flucky wanted volunteers. When he asked, every hand on the boat went up. 80-some men, and not one of them stayed in his rack. So he had to choose. He picked 8. No married men, except Hatfield. Flucka wanted at least one man who'd built the thing standing over it when it went into the ground. One representative from nearly every department on the boat. Torpedo room, engine room, galley, bridge. A mix of regular Navy and reservists. When the names went up, the 8 men who'd been picked were happy about it. The 70-some who hadn't were not, and said so, loudly enough that Flucky heard about it for days afterward. And, where he could manage it, former Boy Scouts. Flucky had been one himself, years before. He knew what the Scout handbook taught about reading a compass in the dark, finding north without one, walking out of unfamiliar woods toward a coastline you couldn't see. If anything went wrong on that beach, if the boats couldn't wait, if the 8 of them had to scatter and find their own way, he wanted men who'd at least been taught how to try. According to Flucky's own account of the patrol, there was one more volunteer he had to turn down. Barb was carrying a Japanese prisoner, picked up earlier in the cruise. The man asked to go ashore with the demolition party. He gave his word he wouldn't run. Flucky said no, but before the subject was closed, the prisoner gave them something useful. What he knew about the patrols that walked that stretch of beach at night, and how often they came by. Down in the engine room, 2 machinists' mates went to work with torches and steel plate, cutting and bending tools that didn't exist in any Navy supply catalog. Something to dig with, something to carry the charge, something that would hold up in soft sand and not make a sound doing it. By the time they were done, 8 men had a plan, a device built from a boy's trick for cracking walnuts. And 3 days before the next train was due to pass through Patience Bay. The night before the raid, Flucky told his officers he was going ashore himself. He was the commanding officer. He had picked the target, planned the route, timed the trains. As far as he was concerned, that meant he led the party onto the beach. His officer said no, not quietly, either. They reminded him that he was the only man aboard who could get Barb back out through these waters if something went wrong, and that if he insisted on going, they would radio Pearl Harbor and let Comsubpac order him to stay aboard his own boat. Flucky backed down. Command of the shore party went to Lieutenant William Walker, the boat's engineering officer. 8 men, 1 lieutenant, and a 55-pound charge that Hatfield had spent the better part of 2 days wiring by hand. 55 pounds doesn't sound like much, Not until it has to be carried through 1,000 yards of reeds, by men who also have to carry everything else. What they carried with them was a strange mix: pistols, flashlights, knives, the digging tools from the engine room, still rough at the edges from the torch. Compasses for men who'd been chosen, partly because they already knew how to read one in the dark. And from the galley, stakes, raw ones wrapped and tucked into a pack, not for themselves, for dogs. Whatever Japanese patrols walked that stretch of beach at night, somebody on Barb had decided there was a decent chance they'd bring a dog along. 8 men weren't going to outrun a dog, but a dog with a stake in front of it wasn't going to raise much of an alarm either. Before they climbed down into the rubber boats, Fluckeye said one more thing. If you get stuck, head for Siberia. 130 miles north. Follow the mountain ranges. Good luck. He meant it as more than a send-off. Barb would surface again at a fixed time in a fixed place and wait. If a Japanese patrol boat showed up first, if anything went wrong before the 8 men made it back, Barb would dive and leave without them. A submarine sitting on the surface 950 yards off an enemy coastline couldn't afford to do anything else. 8 men climbed down into 2 rubber boats. Behind them on Barb's deck, the rest of the crew watched them disappear into the dark, to toward a beach none of them had ever seen, carrying a bomb built from a boy's trick. A few words about Siberia, enough ziked for one dog. The ride to shore took longer than anyone wanted it to. 2 rubber boats, paddled by hand, 950 yards across open water in the dark. Hatfield kept the demolition device reprapsapped against his chest the entire way, shielding it from the spray with his own body every time a wave broke over the side. Nobody talked. The first thing that went wrong was the compass. Somewhere in the dark, between the submarine and the shore, the 2 rubber boats drifted off their heading. Not by much, just enough. When the boats finally scraped onto sand, the 8 men were not where the map said they should be. They were closer to a house than anyone had planned for. 50 yards away, maybe less, sat a building none of them had seen from the periscope. No lights, no sound, just a dark shape against a darker hillside, close enough that a raised voice would carry to it. Nobody spoke above a whisper after that. In the sand near where they'd landed, someone spotted tracks. Dog prints, fresh enough to mean an animal, and whoever was walking it had come this way not long ago. Nobody reached for the stakes, not yet. They kept moving, low and quiet, and whatever dog had made those prints stayed wherever it was, asleep, or somewhere else along the beach entirely. Walker led them inland, off the beach and toward the railroad tracks somewhere ahead. The ground didn't cooperate. A drainage ditch 4 feet deep appeared out of the dark with no warning. Walker went into it head first, gear and all, and came up soaked, hauling himself back onto the bank without a word. They crossed a dirt road. On the other side, a second ditch did exactly what the first one had done. Past the road, the ground turned into bulrushes, reeds and marsh grass, growing thick and well over waist height, stretching out for nearly 1,000 yards between the men and the railroad tracks. There was no way through them quietly. Every step pushed stalks against gear, against clothing, against the men on either side. A dry, crackling sound that seemed, to 8 men trying not to be heard, louder than anything they'd ever listened to in their lives. They moved slowly, stopped, listened, moved again. It took most of an hour to cross 1,000 yards. By the time they reached the other side, every man was soaked through, from the ditches, from the dew on the reeds, from the effort itself. When they finally came out of the reeds, the railroad embankment was right in front of them. A raised bed of gravel and ties, with the rails sitting on top, faintly catching what little light there was. 3 men took up positions as guards, spread out along the embankment, watching the dark in both directions. One of them, John Markison, noticed something else nearby. A tower, off to one side, the kind of structure that might hold a water tank for the steam locomotives running this line. Worth a look. He climbed it. It wasn't a water tower. It was a sentry post, and there was a Japanese inside it, asleep. Markison didn't move for a moment. Then, just as quietly as he'd gone up, he climbed back down. The guard never stirred. Nobody else found out what Markusan had climbed into until he was back on the ground, telling them in a whisper to keep the noise down. There was a man asleep 20 feet over their heads. The work continued. More carefully now, if that was even possible. Digging into a railroad embankment is not like digging into a beach. The ground was packed hard, built up over years of trains running over it, and every scrape of the improvised tools sounded enormous in the stillness. With a sleeping guard, close enough that any one of those sounds might be the one that woke him. They worked in turns. Dig. Stop, listen. Dig again, clearing a space beneath the rail just large enough for the charge. They were not finished when they heard it. A train, coming down the line from the direction they hadn't expected. Earlier than anything, Flucky had clocked from the periscope over 3 days of watching. There was no time to argue and no time to move the gear. 8 men dropped where they were, flattening themselves into the brush at the base of the embankment, the half-buried charge and their tools scattered around them in plain sight. If anyone on that train happened to look down, the train came on. Lit windows passed within a few feet of where they lay, close enough to see shapes. Moving inside, close enough that for several seconds, nobody on the ground was breathing the way a person normally breathes. Then it was gone. Engine, cars, sound, light, all of it rolling away down the coast, leaving the night exactly as dark and quiet as it had been a minute before. They went back to work immediately. The close call hadn't changed anything that still needed doing. The charge still needed to go in the ground, and there was now one less train standing between them and the next one. Hatfield set the device the way he'd built it, the 55 pounds of explosive packed beneath the rail. On top of the rail itself, the pressure switch, sitting exactly where the wheel of the next train would press down on it. One step remained, the final connection, the one that armed the whole thing. The plan called for everyone to pull back to a safe distance for this part. If something went wrong here, with live explosives under his hands in the dark, only one man needed to be close enough to pay for it. Hatfield leaned in to make the connection. Nobody pulled back. 7 men crowded around him instead, peering over his shoulder, watching a Torpteman's hands do the one thing that could end the night for all of them at once. It didn't go wrong. They covered it, smoothed the gravel back into place, checked it once more in the dark by feel, because there was no light to check it by any other way. At 1:32 in the morning, a flashlight blinked twice from the beach. Aboard Barb, watching through binoculars, Flucky let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The signal meant the charge was set, the shore party was alive, and they were on their way back. Then they turned back toward the reeds, toward the ditches, toward the beach and the 2 rubber boats waiting at the water's edge. They were most of the way back across the bulrushes. Boats in sight, the submarine somewhere out in the dark beyond them, when they heard the next train. This one was on schedule. Going back wasn't an option. Neither's was stopping what was already in motion. The charge was in the ground. The switch was set. The train was coming, and 8 men were still on land, still moving toward the water, with nothing left to do but get into the boats and start paddling. They reached the rubber boats and pushed off. They were still in the water. Still close enough to the beach to feel it. Still close enough to be seen if anyone on shore happened to be looking. When the train reached the place where the rail met the rest of America's war, the night came apart a single instant. The locomotive went first, lifted, not just derailed, thrown up and off the tracks, as if something underneath it had simply decided it no longer belonged on the ground. Behind it, the cars followed. 12 freight cars, 2 passenger cars, a mail car, 15 cars and a locomotive, gone in the time it took to draw one breath, folding and piling into itself in the dark, metal grinding against metal, in a sound that didn't stop the way a single explosion stops. Out on the water, 8 men in 2 rubber boats were close enough to feel it. Pieces of the train went up 200 feet into the night air. High enough that for a moment, looking back over their shoulders as they paddled, the wreckage was the brightest thing on that stretch of coastline. Brighter than the stars, brighter than anything that had been there an hour earlier. Aboard Barb, word had already gone out. Flucky had given the order before the boats even reached the beach that night. Any man not standing watch, topside, when this happened. Whatever was about to occur on that railroad track, off the coast of Japan, on a night when most of the Navy was somewhere else entirely, his crew was going to see it. So they stood there, on the deck of a submarine sitting on the surface, less than 1,000 yards from the Japanese mainland, and watched the sky over Patience Bay light up with the wreck of a train that hadn't existed 5 minutes earlier. Out on the water, the boats kept coming. There was no slowing down to admire it. Behind them, the wreckage was still settling, still groaning, still throwing up the occasional shower of sparks where something hot met something that hadn't burned yet. Ahead of them, low and dark against the water, was the only way home. One by one, the boats came alongside. Hands reached down from the deck. Whoever wasn't pulling on a line was reaching for an arm or a shoulder. Anything to help 8 soaked, exhausted men back onto a boat that, until a few minutes ago, none of them had been certain they'd see again. Nobody had been left behind. Nobody had needed Siberia. On deck, the tension didn't last long. 8 men were back, soaked through and grinning, and for a few minutes the war felt very far away. Within minutes, Barb was moving again, away from Patience Bay, away from the coast of Karafuto, away from a wrecked train that, as far as anyone aboard could tell, no one on shore had yet connected to anything but itself. Behind them, on a stretch of Japanese coastline that had carried freight and passengers and mail without interruption, for as long as anyone living there could remember, a railroad line now ended in twisted steel and a hole in the ground, reached on foot, in the dark, by 8 American sailors a few hours earlier. I keep coming back to the walnut. Not the explosion. Not the 200 feet of wreckage. Not even the 8 men still in the water when it happened. The walnut. Somewhere in America, years before any of this, a kid laid a nut on a railroad track because a hammer felt like too much work. Nobody who taught him that trick could have imagined where it would end up. Maybe that's why it stuck with me more than the explosion did. The explosion was the kind of thing a war eventually produces, given enough time and enough people trying. The walnut wasn't. That's usually how it goes with the things that actually win wars. 40 years before that night, Karafuto wasn't Japanese territory at all. It was the southern half of an island called Sakhalin, claimed by Russia, contested by Japan, until the Russo-Japanese War settled the question in 1905. The treaty that ended that war split the island in 2. The southern half went to Japan. From that point on, it was Karafuto. For the next 40 years it stayed Japanese. Settlers moved in. Fishing villages and coal towns grew up along the coast. A railroad was built to connect them. The same railroad Flucky had spent 3 days. Watching through a periscope, the same 8 men had just walked 1,000 yards through reeds to reach. By 1945, that railroad was carrying coal from the interior, fish from the coastal towns, and people back and forth, the way any railroad does, in a place that 40 years to get used to one. By the summer of 1945, the war had reached almost every part of the Japanese Empire in one form or another. But Karafuto sat at the northern edge of it, far from the island-hopping campaigns in the south, far from the cities being targeted by long-range bombers. What military attention it did receive was pointed north, toward the land border with Soviet territory. Not east, toward an empty stretch of coastline and the sea beyond it. 3 weeks after Barb's demolition party climbed back into their boats, that border would matter. The Soviet Union would invade Karafuto from the north, tens of thousands of troops, crossing a line that had held since 1905, as part of its declaration of war against Japan in the closing days of the conflict. But on the night of July 23rd, none of that had happened yet.
Impact energy upon arrival. Penetration was formidable, capable of punching through 20 inches of face-hardened armor at 15,000 yards. Now, contrast this with Japan's crown jewel, the 18.1-inch 45 caliber guns of the Yamato class. 9 of them, arranged in 3 triple turrets, each weighing as much as a destroyer, over 2,000 tons. These were the largest naval rifles ever mounted, with shells tipping the scales at 3,220 pounds, 20% heavier than West Virginia's. Muzzle velocity soared to 2,560 feet per second, granting a theoretical maximum range of 26 miles, 45,800 yards. Rate of fire hovered between 1.5 and 2 rounds per minute, similar to the Americans. On paper, Yamato's guns seemed invincible. Superior throw weight, longer reach, and penetration that could slice through 30 inches of armor at close ranges. But here's where the cracks appear. Japan's high-velocity doctrine came at a cost. Barrel life was abysmal. Only 150 to 200 rounds before replacement. That's half or less than West Virginia's endurance. Dispersion was another Achilles heel. The extreme pressures and velocities caused shells to scatter widely, sometimes by hundreds of yards at maximum range. To compensate, Japanese gunnery officers often used ripple fire, staggering shots within a turret, but this sacrificed salvo cohesion. In contrast, American turrets employed delay coils, ensuring all guns fired simultaneously, for tight, predictable patterns. The real equalizer, though, was not the guns themselves. It was the fire control system. For West Virginia, the Mark 8 radar was revolutionary. Integrated with the Mark 34 director, this was an electromechanical analog computer that continuously calculated firing solutions. It factored in own ship's motion, target speed and bearing, wind deflection, air density, Coriolis effect, and even propellant temperature. Detection range, up to 44,000 yards for large ships. At 22,800 yards, it predicted where a 20-knot target would be 30 seconds later. With uncanny precision, even in total darkness, Japan had nothing comparable. Their radar, like the Type 22, was rudimentary, good for surface search up to 20 miles, but not for blind fire gunnery. They depended on optical rangefinders, massive stereoscopic devices that excelled in clear daylight, but faltered beyond 25,000 yards, or in poor visibility. At night, they were effectively blind. Spotter planes could help, but in the chaos of battle, they were vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. This technological gap stemmed from differing naval doctrines. America, influenced by lessons from the First World War and interwar exercises, prioritized accuracy and sustainability. They invested in electronics early, recognizing that future wars would be fought at extreme ranges and under all conditions. Japan, shaped by their victory at Tsushima in 1905, clung to the idea of the decisive battle, a close-range slugfest where bigger guns won. They poured billions into Yamato's armor and size, neglecting radar and fire control advancements. By 1944, this mismatch was glaring. West Virginia's guns, though smaller, were more reliable and, crucially, guided by eyes that never blinked. Yamato's Titans, for all their might, fired into uncertainty. These details weren't just numbers on blueprints. They played out in blood and steel during the furious engagements of the Pacific. As we turn to the combat record, you'll see how West Virginia's resurrection turned the tide in one of history's greatest naval showdowns. The Battle of Leyte Gulf awaited, where radar met resolve, and an outdated ship etched her name in legend. These technical details weren't just numbers on blueprints, they played out in blood and steel during the furious engagements of the Pacific. As we turn to the combat record, you'll see how West Virginia's resurrection turned the tide in one of history's greatest naval showdowns. The Battle of Leyte Gulf awaited, where radar met resolve, and an outdated ship etched her name in legend. West Virginia's combat legacy begins from her resurrection after Pearl Harbor, as detailed earlier, where she suffered heavy damage but was salvaged and refitted as a symbol of resilience. By mid-1944, she rejoined the fleet, her radar eyes scanning the horizon. Her first taste of vengeance came in the Philippines campaign. In October 1944, the Allies launched the invasion of Leyte, a stepping stone to liberate the archipelago from Japanese occupation. Japan, facing existential threat, committed nearly its entire remaining surface fleet. In Operation Shogo, a multi-pronged assault to destroy the American beachhead, the Southern Force, under Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, included the battleships Yamashiro and Fuso, both older designs but heavily armed. Yamashiro, like her sister, carried 12 14-inch guns, modernized with improved fire control. Nishimura's mission: punch through Surigao Strait and ravage the landing forces at dawn. Opposing him was Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's Task Force 77.2, a line of 6 American battleships, including West Virginia, Tennessee, California, Maryland, Mississippi, and Pennsylvania. Oldendorf, a gunnery expert, arranged his heavies in a classic battle line positioned to cross the T, a maneuver where his broadsides could rake the enemy column, while they could only reply with forward guns. The night of October 24th to 25th was ink black, with no moon to betray positions. Nishimura's force steamed blindly northward, relying on scouts and luck. At 2:53 a.m., American PT boats and destroyers harassed the Japanese, torpedoing Fuso and damaging others. But the real ambush came at 3:02 a.m. West Virginia's Mark 8 radar painted the contacts, Yamashiro and her escorts, at 44,000 yards, beyond visual range. Oldendorf held fire, letting the enemy close. At 3:51 a.m., with the range down to 30,000 yards, destroyers launched a torpedo ambush, further crippling the Japanese. Yamashiro pressed on, her guns silent in the dark. As mentioned in the hook, West Virginia led with radar-guided salvos, firing 93 rounds accurately, contributing to Yamashiro reeling under the onslaught. Tennessee and California joined in, their own radars guiding salvos. One shell penetrated her boiler rooms, dropping her speed from 20 knots to 5. Another detonated in her magazines, triggering secondary explosions. By 4:10 a.m., she was a blazing hulk, listing heavily. At 4:19, she capsized and sank, taking over 1,000 crew with her. The cruiser Mogami, crippled by torpedoes and shells, followed soon after. Nishimura perished with his flagship. The southern force was annihilated. Only one destroyer escaped. Oldendorf's victory was total, with minimal American losses. He radioed famously, "My situation is, I am now retiring from the battle area. Enemy surface forces in south have been routed." This was radar's triumph. Without it, the battle might have devolved into a chaotic melee, where Japanese optics could shine in close quarters. Instead, West Virginia and her sisters fired with impunity from the shadows. But Leyte Gulf wasn't just Surigao. To the north, in the battle off Samar, Yamato herself entered the fray. Part of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, Yamato, the 72,000-ton Leviathan, stumbled upon Task Unit 77.4.3, known as Taffy 3, a group of escort carriers and destroyers. At 7 a.m. on October 25th, Yamato's lookouts spotted the Americans at 35,000 yards. She opened fire, her 18.1-inch guns thundering. The first salvos straddled the carrier. White planes, with one shell detonating underwater, causing shock damage, but no direct hit. As the range closed to 21,000 yards, Yamato scored direct hits on the destroyer Johnston, 3 shells slamming home. Yet the plucky destroyer charged on, laying smoke and torpedoes. Yamato also hit the escort carrier Gambier Bay, contributing to her sinking. But this was no decisive victory. Outnumbered and outgunned, the American tin cans and jeep carriers fought like lions, their wildcat fighters and torpedoes forcing Kurita to maneuver wildly. Yamato, dodging torpedoes, was separated from her force and failed to press the advantage. Kurita, believing he faced a larger fleet, withdrew, a tactical blunder that saved the invasion. Yamato's guns, for all their power, achieved only partial success against inferior opponents. No battleship kills, no overwhelming dominance. Her dispersion issues and lack of radar meant many salvos missed entirely. In contrast, West Virginia's precise, radar-guided fire at Surigao was a masterclass in efficiency. If you're finding this deep dive into World War II naval warfare fascinating, Subscribing takes just a second and supports more content like this. Hit that button now. And let's continue. West Virginia's legend didn't end at Leyte. In December 1944, she supported landings at Mindoro, bombarding Japanese positions with her 16-inch guns. Shells cratered airfields and supply dumps, suppressing resistance. Then, in January 1945, the invasion of Luzon at Lingayen Gulf, West Virginia led the bombardment, firing over 1,000 rounds to soften beaches and silence batteries. Her accuracy, honed by radar, demolished pillboxes and artillery, but danger lurked from above. Kamikaze attacks intensified. On January 6th, a Zero crashed into her, killing 4 and wounding dozens. Yet, her damage control teams, veterans of Pearl, contained the fires. She remained on station. February brought Iwo Jima, the volcanic fortress. West Virginia arrived on the 19th, her guns pounding Mount Suribachi and the airfield. Over 10 days, she expended thousands of shells, breaking up Japanese counterattacks and supporting Marines ashore. Her spotters, using radar and optics, adjusted fire with deadly precision. One barrage destroyed a key ammunition depot, lighting the sky for miles. Finally, Okinawa, the bloodiest amphibious assault of the Pacific. From April 1st, 1945, West Virginia anchored off the island, providing continuous fire support. Her 16-inch shells hammered caves and bunkers, where Japanese defenders hid. Kamikazes swarmed like hornets. On April 6th, one struck her forward turret, killing several gunners. Another grazed her superstructure. But she endured, downing 8 aircraft with her anti-aircraft batteries. Through May and June, she fired relentlessly, her barrels glowing red from overuse. By war's end, West Virginia had steamed over 100,000 miles, fired thousands of main battery rounds, and earned 5 battle stars. Yamato's fate, meanwhile, was a tragic coda. In April 1945, during Operation 10 Go, she sortied for Okinawa, a suicide mission to beach herself as a floating battery. Intercepted by American carriers, she faced Task Force 58. Without air cover, Yamato absorbed 11 torpedoes and 7 bombs. Her magazines exploded at 2:23 p.m. on April 7th, creating a mushroom cloud visible for miles. She sank with 2,500 souls. Her guns fired sparingly, claiming no major hits. A symbol of misplaced priorities. Size over adaptability. West Virginia's combat record proves the power of revival. From Pearl's depths to Okinawa's shores, she outfought expectations. Admiral Oldendorf praised her. West Virginia's radar fire was phenomenal. Hits on the first salvo at extreme range. Even Japanese accounts noted the invisible enemy that struck from the dark. This wasn't luck. It was the marriage of sturdy 1923 engineering with 1944 innovation. As we compare her directly to rivals, the reasons for her success crystallize. Why did America's outdated battleship consistently outperform Japan's Titans? The answers lie in the metrics of war: penetration, accuracy, and endurance. Let's break it down. As we compare West Virginia directly to her rivals, the reasons for her success crystallize. Why did America's outdated battleship from 1923 consistently outperform Japan's Titans? The answers lie in the metrics of war: penetration, accuracy, endurance, and the overarching design philosophies that defined each Navy's approach. Let's break it down, starting with raw destructive power. Penetration. The super heavy armor-piercing variant, introduced later, boosted this to 22 inches at the same range, ensuring the shell retained energy without shattering on impact, dropping to 25 at 20,000. Their heavier shells and higher velocity gave them an edge in raw punching power, about 20% better against thick belts. But this advantage diminished at extreme ranges, where air resistance sapped the lighter density projectiles. Moreover, penetration alone doesn't win battles. You must hit the target first. Here, accuracy becomes the great divider. West Virginia's fire control, bolstered by the Mark 8 radar, delivered pinpoint salvos. The analog computers adjusted for every variable, from sea swell to barrel temperature, ensuring clusters that straddled or struck home. In Surigao Strait, her first salvo at 22,800 yards, scored hits, a feat of precision in utter darkness. Japan's system lagged far behind. Yamato's optical rangefinders were world-class in daylight, with stereoscopic baselines up to 25 feet, allowing accurate spotting to 30,000 yards under ideal conditions. But without radar integration, night battles turned them impotent. Dispersion plagued their guns. At maximum range, shells could scatter over 500 yards. A football field of error. This stemmed from the high pressures in their massive chambers, which stressed barrels unevenly. Even in tests, Japanese gunnery officers noted inconsistent patterns, requiring bracketing fire to walk onto targets. In Samar, Yamato's long-range shots at 35,000 yards resulted in near misses, not the devastating blows her designers envisioned. Endurance tells another story. West Virginia's barrels lasted 250 to 300 rounds, double or triple some contemporaries. This allowed sustained bombardments, like at Iwo Jima, where she fired for days without degradation. Yamato's guns wore out after 150 to 200 shots, limiting prolonged engagements. Relining a turret at sea was impossible. It required dry dock time Japan couldn't afford late in the war. Broader comparisons reveal systemic flaws. Against her own Navy's later designs, West Virginia held her own. The Iowa class, with 16-inch 50 caliber guns, offered longer range, 38,000 yards, and higher velocity, but at the cost of increased wear. Iowa's barrels lasted about 290 rounds, similar to West Virginia, but her speed and armor made her a thoroughbred. Yet, West Virginia's refit bridged the gap. Her radar made her as effective in fire control as the newer ships. In fact, during Leyte, she outperformed some sisters without full radar upgrades. Now, pit her against other Japanese vessels. Yamashiro's 14-inch guns, while numerous, lacked range. 22,000 yards max, and her fire control was pre-radar. In Surigao, she never got a shot off before being pummeled. Similarly, other Japanese ships like the Nagato class suffered poor dispersion and lack of radar, failing to match West Virginia's edge. Italy's Littorio class, though not direct foes, mirrors Japan's mistakes. High-velocity 15-inch guns, with chronic scattering, lasting only 120 rounds. Germany's Bismarck, with 15-inch guns, managed 180 to 210 rounds, but her optics failed in foul weather. America's philosophy, reliability over extremes, echoed Britain's successful 15-inch Mark I, which outlasted rivals by double. West Virginia, reborn with electronic sight, was the apex predator. Cost factors underscore this. Yamato devoured resources equivalent to several carriers, a fleet Japan desperately needed. West Virginia's refit cost a fraction, yielding exponential returns. In every metric, from barrel life to battle effectiveness, the outdated American proved superior. Skeptics who dismissed her as obsolete were proven wrong, just as those who bet on Japanese invincibility faltered. This comparison illuminates why technology and adaptability triumph over brute force. As we wrap up with her legacy, West Virginia stands as a testament to ingenuity in the face of adversity. From the ashes of Pearl to the victory in the Pacific, her story endures. As we wrap up with her legacy, West Virginia stands as a testament to ingenuity in the face of adversity. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor to the victory in the Pacific, her story endures. A narrative of revival and resolve. Decommissioned in 1947, after the war's end, she had earned 15 battle honors, more than many of her peers. That's a tally spanning Pearl Harbor, Leyte Gulf, Lingayen, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and beyond. She was the only battleship to fight in both the first and last surface actions of the American Pacific Campaign, from the defense of the Philippines in 1942 to the final bombardments off Japan. Her 16-inch guns, designed in the 19-teens, continued to serve long after her retirement. Turrets and barrels were recycled into the Iowa-class battleships, which saw action through the Korean War, Vietnam, and even the Gulf War in 1991. That's 68 years of service, from a design penned before the Great Depression. No other naval gun in history matched that longevity in frontline duty. In contrast to West Virginia, Yamato's legacy is one of unfulfilled potential, serving only 4 years before sinking. She never sank an enemy battleship, never turned the tide in a major engagement. Her massive guns fired in anger only a handful of times, mostly at aircraft or smaller vessels. Yamato became a symbol of imperial overreach, a resource sink that could have built carriers or submarines to better counter the American advance. Today, her wreck lies in 2,000 feet of water, a relic explored by submersibles, while West Virginia's spirit lives on in museums and naval lore. The record she set at Surigao Strait, that hit at 22,000